I'm standing not far from the Reichstag building in Berlin, surrounded by offices for the Bundestag. Back there is the official residence of the Chancellor. But 90 years ago, the Nazis had planned to build right here some of the most impressive and huge buildings on the planet. A project which, as you can probably see, never really got off the ground. But they did still leave their mark on Berlin, so let's take a look at what the city might have looked like had history taken a slightly different course.
Even if most of the Nazis' ideas never came to fruition, we can still get a hint of what could have been. So let's start with what didn't happen.
The Reichstag building would have been dwarfed by the Great Hall, a domed building so huge it's said that clouds would have formed inside of it. It would have been back there, bridging the river, which would have been slightly diverted. And the whole thing would have been part of a larger complex, which would have included the Führer's palace over there, the Führer's office somewhere in that direction, and the headquarters of the military high command.
The Great Hall, also called the People's Hall or the Hall of Fame, was to accommodate 180,000 people with a dome 200 meters high and 250 meters in diameter, with about 38,000 square meters of floor space. Even Hitler's chief architect Albert Speer worried that this was too much and that it would have had the effect of reducing Hitler to an almost invisible dot. Also, the damp breath of all those people would certainly have condensed and fallen like a fine drizzle. The very ambitious plan was for construction to take about 10 years and be complete by 1950.
Most of the buildings in this area were demolished, with the notable exception of the Swiss embassy. In fact, when construction began on that office block over there, workers were surprised to discover sheet piling buried underground, meaning that the Nazis had in fact started work on diverting the river.
And all this was to transform Berlin into a new city, to show the whole world how it's done, one that Hitler himself was thinking could be called Germania. But that decision could wait. There was a lot of work to be done. Our first glimpse of the proposed future is out in the borough of Charlottenburg, the local tax office, completed in 1939 and featuring a Nazi eagle holding in its talons, well, it is a swastika, as if taxes weren't scary enough, but of course now it's carefully hidden by the house number.
And by the way, we are on the east-west axis, which was originally built at the end of the 17th century to link the royal palace in Berlin with the royal residence in Lietzenburg, which is now Schloss Charlottenburg.
Well, not directly to the Schloss. You have to walk towards it down a long avenue. But yes, the road is immediately obvious on any map of Berlin, beginning at the city palace and going through the Brandenburg Gate on its way to Charlottenburg and what is now Theodor-Heuss-Platz, named after the first president of the Federal Republic of Germany, and which is now home to the Eternal Flame, a memorial to displaced persons. Originally, it was called Reichskanzlerplatz, but in 1933 it was inevitably renamed Adolf Hitler Platz. The proposed monument to Mussolini, however, never got built. This axis was to be widened, including the extended section westwards and a new extension eastwards, although the idea of the eastern extension was later abandoned. And that was no easy task, as this strange piece of architecture bears witness. If it seems oddly out of proportion to you, there's a reason for that.
The Charlottenburg Gate was built here in 1907 at the entrance to what was at the time the separate city of Charlottenburg. 30 years later, the Nazis rebuilt this entire bridge and widened the road in time for Hitler's 50th birthday celebrations. And this meant that both halves of the gate had to be dismantled and then reassembled further apart.
There was no need for a gate to even be here, as by the 20th century, walled cities were a thing of the past. But Charlottenburg didn't want to be outshone by Berlin, and so built a gate anyway. Of course, in 1920, Charlottenburg was incorporated into Berlin and so lost its identity as a city, but it still had a gate. And by the way, there was a parade here for Hitler's 50th birthday in 1939. It lasted 4.5 hours. At least this road was partially completed. An even more ambitious road never even got started.
This is a part of the east-west axis, and if it seems a little quieter than usual at the moment, that's because this part is closed for now as they're still tidying up after the marathon. But anyway, pretty much where I'm standing, there used to be another road called Victory Avenue. What the Nazis had in mind was to widen it considerably so that it would form part of the new north-south axis. But that never happened. Instead, after the war, all traces of Victory Avenue were removed, and right where the axes were supposed to cross, the Soviets built their war memorial.
If you know where to look, you can still see the curbstones marking the intersection with Victory Avenue, but otherwise it's gone. Even the Victory column, which was at the northern end of Victory Avenue, just in front of the Reichstag building, is not there anymore. The Nazis moved it onto the east-west axis, not as some guidebooks insist because it got in the way of Hitler's car or his view of the cheering crowds, but as part of a long-term plan to completely redesign huge chunks of Berlin. To that end, a huge swathe of land either side of the proposed north-south axis was to be cleared, and vast new buildings would be built, mostly for the government itself. The 1,000-year Reich had to impress the world after all. Work on that never really got started, but let's look at what did go beyond the drawing board. And this is probably how you would imagine Nazi architecture would look. This was built to house the aviation ministry, just a stone's throw from Potsdamer Platz. It's now used by the finance ministry. It's solid and a bit severe, and designed on the principle that form follows function. Interestingly though, it is no taller than the buildings around it, which might surprise you after seeing the plans for the Great Hall. It doesn't look very much out of place next to the palace that houses the Bundesrat, which is effectively the German parliament's upper house. To truly appreciate how big it is, you have to see it from above. It's a vast, sprawling complex with over 2,000 offices, making the Bundesrat look, by comparison, like an annex. Right next to the Charlottenburg Gate is a smaller building built specifically for the Council of Municipalities, a body which was supposedly a talking shop for local communities but was actually a means for central government to impose its will on local government. Today, it's used by the modern Office for Building and Regional Planning. Of course, if you're asking who was to bankroll all of this, then obviously the central bank, and that's what this was built as, or rather, it was built as an extension to the original building. It may not look like it, but in terms of volume, it is the third largest single building in Berlin. After the war, it was the headquarters of the Central Committee of the SED, the party that ruled East Germany for most of its existence. It's now used by the Foreign Office. Pretty much at the other end of the scale, we have the Tiergarten Borough Council offices, although thanks to the Nazis' policy of Gleichschaltung, it wasn't intended for any policy making. The only thing local governments needed to do was admin. But for a better idea of the Nazi vision, visit Fährberliner Platz. It's not easy to see because of the trees and the U-Bahn station built in 1970, in case you couldn't tell just by looking, but there is a whole ensemble here. Administrative offices for a department store chain, the headquarters of an insurance company, the offices of the Reich Grain Authority, the headquarters of the German Labour Front, and administrative offices for the Labour Front's insurance group.
For a few years after the war, this building behind me was used by the British occupying forces as their headquarters, and they called it Lancaster House. They also hit upon the rather bizarre idea that an ideal gift to the city of Berlin would be a British post box and a British telephone box. and they're still here today.
Actually, most of the buildings here were used by the British and given similar names by them. But again, the basic effect is that while the buildings are in fact big, they don't seem out of proportion. Neither were they in any uniform style. There was no one Nazi style, and instead the buildings were functional and designed in a sort of simplified classical style embellished with a few Nazi symbols and other flourishes in keeping with the party's general ideology. That, though, wasn't always the case, and the regime was quite prepared to go back to a more traditional style, as they did with one building designed to keep Mussolini happy, and which still serves as the Italian embassy. It was inspired by Italian Renaissance palaces, just slightly modernized. But what of ordinary people? What were they going to get? Residential accommodation wasn't a priority for the regime, but since plans for the north-south axis involved demolishing great numbers of apartments, they had to build something. And they made a start at the southern end of the borough of Schöneberg, 2,000 apartments in 6 blocks. And when I say that residential accommodation wasn't a priority, I really mean it. Official guidelines issued in 1935 mandated that apartments be built as cheaply as possible, and developers were incentivized to cut corners wherever they could. Regulations from the Weimar Republic era designed to avoid squalor and overcrowding were ignored. These apartments were modernized in the 1980s, but as one resident told me, they are still cramped and damp, but affordable, which in today's Berlin is increasingly rare. But there is one other positive thing to say about them.
One of the things that you might immediately notice is that there are a lot of wide open spaces. Certainly a welcome change to the older buildings in the centre, built around tiny courtyards that were often dismal and dark. But the reason the Nazis built in this way has nothing to do with improved living conditions. It's because they were fighting a war at the time, and they guessed, correctly as it turned out, that their enemies would want to bomb residential areas and try to create firestorms.
Residential blocks built the traditional way made firestorms easier, as their tiny courtyards created a chimney effect, something much harder to do here. And because the courtyards weren't closed on all sides, the shock waves from any explosion had space to dissipate, resulting in less damage overall. This is all for the working classes, but the Nazis also had ideas about housing their elite, and for that, we need to go to a housing project in Krummelanke.
The Nazis really wanted the best of both worlds. On the one hand, they wanted to be at the forefront of progress and technology and to be a model for the entire world. But on the other, they also wanted to preserve traditional German values. And so this was to be the model for the countryside. Small cottages in an idyllic rural setting, built in a style that was known as homeland protection.
These were built for high-ranking SS officers, although the original plans were a lot more extensive than what eventually got built. It did, though, serve to represent traditional conservative values as well as reflect the blood and soil ideology of the party. This was an ideology that idealized rural life, or at least rural life as imagined by the Nazis, a fairy tale version of the real world. But offices and homes aren't the only things a city needs. Contrary to popular belief, the autobahn connecting Charlottenburg with Potsdam wasn't built by the Nazis. It was opened in 1921 as a racetrack consisting of a very long straight with a loop at either end. Under the Nazis, there were a couple of changes: a grandstand, which still exists but has now been converted into offices, and a new building for administrative offices that included a tower for the judges, today functioning as a motel, although it has clearly seen better days. And in both buildings we can see that basic functionality was the guiding principle in their design. They were simple and practical. Not far away is the exhibition ground, originally opened in the 1920s, but with a Nazi-era pavilion still in use today. And I honestly didn't realize the adult entertainment industry's trade fair would be starting the week I was in Berlin to make this video. I don't know what the Nazis would have made of this. They actually wanted to encourage sex, just so long as it was ethnic Germans having the sex and making lots of ethnic German babies. On the other hand, I think going this far might have offended their sense of morality. Like several of the places in this video, this building was used as a location in the movie Valkyrie, although it played the role of the headquarters of the SS. In reality, the SS used as its headquarters a much older building, a former hotel, which no longer exists. But if you can recognize the greatly streamlined classical elements in the Trade Fair Pavilion, you can also see them at that most notorious fun and games venue in Berlin, the Olympic Stadium, built, of course, for the infamous 1936 Summer Olympics. It's not true, by the way, that Hitler fled the stadium to avoid having to present a medal to the black American who in several disciplines beat his white Germanic athletes, but that certainly was embarrassing for the white supremacists in the party. Like so many of the Nazis' bigger projects, it looks deceptively low-key, but because the track and field inside are lower than the surrounding ground, it's actually larger than you might think. It was originally built for 100,000 people. It's still in use today, although now with a capacity of less than 75,000 and mostly for soccer. It's the home ground of the local team Hertha BSC. An interesting detail is that the plaza in front of it actually narrows slightly towards the stadium itself. This was intended to make it seem longer than it actually is and to increase the feeling of anticipation felt by spectators as they walked towards the main entrance. The stadium was built on the site of an already existing sports ground, and the U-Bahn station serving it was also rebuilt. As you have probably now come to expect, the design is simple and functional. It's spacious because it had to be to cope with the expected crowds. If you're a fan of urban public transport, this is where the U-Bahn Museum is. Another U-Bahn station rebuilt by the Nazis is Möckernbrücke, once again simple and functional. It's on one of the elevated sections of the system now served by lines 1 and 3, which is also one of the oldest parts of the network. Berlin's U-Bahn was originally intended to be an elevated tramway until local politicians insisted that it be built in tunnels out of sight. This station features a roof that extends the entire length of the platform, an improvement over the original design as seen here a few stops further down the line. As far as the U-Bahn is concerned, that pretty much covers everything that was done in the Nazi period. The railways, though, that was a different matter.
This station is relatively new. It was built after reunification as what public transport planners call a shoulder station. It's a station outside of the main central area of the city to take pressure off the main central railway station. But before then it was just an S-Bahn stop where the Dresden and Anhalt lines cross the Ring Line. However, had the Nazis got their way, then not far away from here they would have built their massive southern railway station, which would have been a lot bigger than what we eventually did get.
At the time, Berlin had a number of railway termini, each for trains to different destinations. One terminus was close to the modern-day central station for trains to Hamburg in the northwest. The Nazis planned to rebuild the network with 2 massive stations for long-distance trains.
And here is where the Nazis planned their northern railway station. And from here, you would have had a fantastic view of the Great Hall reflected in a vast artificial lake.
As for local trains, the S-Bahn network already existed with a Ring Line and an East-West line, but it lacked a line from north to south, and this is what the Nazis built. At its southern end, it started at the terminus for trains to the south, of which today only a small fragment of the entrance still stands. The line went underground here as there was no room to build it above ground, stopped at another major terminus at Potsdamer Platz, continued past the Brandenburg Gate, crossed the east-west line at Friedrichstraße and then made its way to the terminus for trains to the Baltic coast, and continued along the main line to where it crosses the Ring Line at Gesundbrunnen. This line still forms a vital part of Berlin's public transport system, even if most of the mainline stations it once served no longer exist. Naturally, a video like this can't be made without mentioning Tempelhof Airport. Like so many buildings I've spoken about so far, this one hides its massive size very well. The airport already existed, but the Nazis built a vast terminal building, together with another building just over the road called Columbia House that was used by Lufthansa. When it was built, the airport was the largest single building in the world, a record it held until the completion of the Pentagon about 2 years later. Designed to handle up to 6 million passengers a year, it sadly wasn't as future-proof as the Nazis had hoped. It was next to a residential area and could never cope with the bigger aircraft that became the norm later. It remained in service for small planes, processing a couple of 100,000 passengers a year, until it finally closed in 2008. The building is currently used for various cultural events and also a refugee shelter, and the rest is a public park. Autobahns were a particular obsession, of course, even though the Nazis didn't in fact invent them. When they built this factory for Telefunken, a manufacturer of radio and television receivers, they took the opportunity to build the first few hundred meters of what was to be one of several Autobahn rings encircling the city.
But what in fact happened was that after the Second World War, the Americans used this building as an army barracks that just happened to come complete with a convenient asphalted area perfect for military parades. In 1976, the 200th anniversary of the American Day of Independence, the local council offered to give this space an American name, and General Tice of the Berlin Brigade suggested 4th of July Square. Of course, now that it's no longer needed for military parades, it's being converted into a much more pleasant green space.
And yes, this is being done by the company responsible for the railway infrastructure. It's to compensate for the loss of trees to the reconstruction and reactivation of the main line to Dresden. When they built the new north-south S-Bahn line, the Nazis included a new station which again is surprisingly small and functional. It's next to a public park called the Humboldthain, which is the location of a stark reminder of what the Nazi regime eventually led to. It's hard to see with all the trees, especially as it's half buried under an artificial hill made of rubble. It's a flak tower. This structure was one of many built in German cities as platforms for anti-aircraft guns, as well as providing shelter to civilians. After the war, the occupying French troops demolished half of this tower, leaving the rest standing in order not to damage the railway tracks. About 1.6 million cubic meters of rubble from the ruined city were dumped here, and it now provides an excellent view of northern Berlin. Closer to the center is this bunker built by forced laborers, mostly Soviet prisoners. They never actually finished it, but after post-war attempts to demolish it failed, it was turned into a functioning bunker with room for almost 5,000 people. And yes, your eyes do not deceive you, a huge apartment block was built over it and the road in the 1970s. It is no longer officially a bunker and is instead used for cultural events. There are a few more relics of the Nazi regime, but this is most of them. The truly astounding outsized projects the Nazis had in mind never came to be. Those they did manage to complete weren't in any one uniform style, but rather tried to reinterpret classical architecture for a new age. This was a regime that wanted to be both the guardian of traditional values and a pioneer for the future, and which ultimately failed at both.
A an American. In fact, they also hit upon the rather bizarre idea. Thank you, mate. It would have been part of a massive complex which would have included the